Okay, good. So today is our last lecture, and we've talked about carbohydrates and fats, lipids, and today we're going to focus on protein-rich foods and especially the role of nitrogen in food and in growing our food. So this is particularly relevant to this group because there's general nutritional advice that as people get older, they sometimes become somewhat deficient in the amount of protein they eat in their diet. And so older people are encouraged to kind of up the amount of protein. And these are kind of major sources of protein, kind of unlike sugars or unlike lipids. It's hard to eat something that's really pure protein. It's usually mixed in with other things. Probably the closest you can get to something that's pure protein is egg whites. Now the yolk has a lot of other ingredients in it, but egg whites are almost pure protein. And in general, eggs are considered to be very good food. And it makes sense because everything's packed in there for the development of a new animal, a chicken. And of course, if we eat the cells of other animals, they are loaded with the nutrients identical to what's in our cells. And so they're a good mix of things. If you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you need to get most of your protein from beans, especially legumes. Cereal grains have a fair amount, nuts, etc. One other good source is not shown on here, something like cottage cheese. It's got a lot of protein and it's fairly low fat. Get low fat cottage cheese. All right, so let's talk about what proteins are and how we get them in our food. Proteins are made of long chains of amino acids, and there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. So here is the standard chemical formula. So an amino acid has an amine group, NH2 is an amine, and it has a carboxyl group, an acid group, COOH. So this proton down here, this H, can come off, and H plus is what acid is. If something is very acid, it's got a lot of H plus in the solution. And so the central carbon here is a linker between the amine group and the acid group. And it can have attached to it many other atoms. And there are, in fact, hundreds of different kinds of amino acids, but there are 20 that are universally used from bacteria to plants to animals to make proteins. And we're going to come back to that composition of the R group in a little bit. But first, why do we need this? Well, it's because in sugars and lipids, we've been dealing with molecules that are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But many of the molecules in our body contain nitrogen, require nitrogen. So amino acids have to have this amino group, but another very common, abundant class of molecules are the nucleotides. These are the things that make up DNA, the ACTG. Those are the names of different nucleotides. And they're in DNA and RNA. The ATP, the triphosphate on a nucleotide that we use to drive our muscles and pump sodium, and it's the major energy currency that requires nitrogen. So notice up here, you have this ring in which there are 4 nitrogens in the ring and another nitrogen off to the side. So we get the nitrogen from these molecules primarily from eating protein and amino acids, and then we can transfer this nitrogen to make molecules like this more complex one over here. Now, where does it come from in our food? And nitrogen has rather interesting chemistry, a bit different from what we've been talking about so far. So we emphasize the fact that, we're all solar powered in the end. We use the energy from our sun to shine on the chlorophyll in plants, and they take up oxygen and CO2 and water and make sugars. And they can also use these same basic molecules to make lipids and fats, and you get plant oils. So they can either get things out of the air, like these two molecules, or there are nutrients, elements in the soil, like phosphorus and potassium. But the nitrogen is a rather interesting special case. And why is that? Well, I've emphasized how plants can do almost everything, but one important piece of biochemistry plants cannot do is to use this nitrogen in the air and take it up through their leaves and convert it to something like an amino acid. Plants can't do that reaction. They require bacteria in the soil to do that reaction. And we're going to talk just a little bit about how that happens. So air is 80% nitrogen gas. We are sitting in an ocean of nitrogen right now as we watch this talk. But very few organisms, just a few kinds of bacteria, can actually use it. And why is that so? Why is it different? Well, it's because nitrogen gas has a triple bond between the two nitrogen atoms. And this triple bond is very hard to break. So right at the beginning, we talked about the basic chemistry of these different molecules. We said that they like to have 8 electrons around their outer shell. And so this nitrogen has a pair that it shares with nitrogen here, a second pair, a third pair. So that's 2, 4, 6. Plus it has 2 other electrons, 7, 8. So 8 electrons around this nitrogen. This one, when you count these shared pairs, 8 electrons around it. But this is a very tough bond. 3 double bonds holding these 2 molecules together, and to break it apart and to make something else is a reaction that takes a lot of energy. This process of taking nitrogen gas apart and taking the N2 and making molecules like NH3, ammonia, or nitrogen plus oxygen like nitrate. This process is called nitrogen fixation. When you fix nitrogen, you're taking the gas and you're making it into these other kinds of molecules. These molecules, plants can take up, and they can take these molecules and make amino acids out of them. We cannot do that reaction, even if we get ammonia and nitrate. We cannot use these compounds. We have to get it from plants. Okay, so how does this happen? Well, the nitrogen then in our food actually comes from 2 different types of reactions. In one case, the reaction is made by an industrial process. So this was invented just before World War I, beginning of the 19th century, when it was discovered that if you took nitrogen gas and combined it with hydrogen gas in a closed container with using these metal catalysts at high temperature and very high pressure, you could essentially force the hydrogens to combine with the nitrogens, and you could produce ammonia. And then this ammonia be fed to plants, and the plants would make the amino acids. Now, how do plants do it in the absence of this synthetically made ammonia? Well, there are bacteria that are able to do the process, and they contain a special enzyme called nitrogenase. It's a big enzyme, and it will take nitrogen gas. It'll take electrons that it gets from other molecules, electron carriers, like we talked about in the section on energy, plus protons. And the enzyme, in a really very complex reaction, this is just not a one-step reaction. There are a whole series of intermediates and steps involved in this. It'll use the energy in ATP to basically force the nitrogen gas to be separated into 2 atoms, and then these atoms have hydrogen attached to them, And so what you get out of this is ammonia. So this can be done by bacteria in association with plants. Interesting byproduct of this reaction is this actually produces hydrogen gas. Notice that nitrogenase, unlike the synthetic process, starts with hydrogen gas, but in the reactions catalyzed by these bacteria, it does not use any hydrogen gas. It actually takes hydrogen out of the water and makes gas. And there's a small field in biochemistry that is trying to use this process as having a solar energy driven way to make hydrogen. The problem with it is that it takes a lot of energy. You've got to kind of feed these plants with a lot of fuel in order to produce very much hydrogen. So in the long run, it's a rather iffy as to whether this is going to work. All right, so you got these two, these are the principal ways we get nitrogen in our food, either from synthetic nitrogen or from nitrogen that was fixed by bacteria. There is, interestingly, another way that produces a small amount, but the idea here is if you had, a lot of energy and heat involved, maybe you could make ammonia. I don't know if anybody has any guesses or heard the other way you can get true nature-made fertilizer, and that is by lightning. You can just imagine the amount of energy in a lightning bolt, tremendous heat, and this lightning bolt is going through a mix of water vapor, oxygen, and 80% nitrogen. And it's been measured that a big bolt of lightning like this could make 1,000 pounds of ammonia. So in the greater scale of things, it's not a big contributor, but in places that have lightning storms, there is a kind of little bit of rain of fixed nitrogen onto the fields. Here in California, if we depended on this, we'd be in big trouble because, boy, it's not very often that we see real lightning here or even in the Central Valley where we grow all of our food. All right. So let's just kind of summarize here. So you have biological nitrogen fixation. And the way that works is that in the soil, there are these free living bacteria, and they can fix nitrogen on their own, but they need a lot of ATP to do that. They need a lot of sugar or food source. And so what the bacteria do is they associate with the roots of plants. The plants provide sugars to the bacteria that they can use to make ATP. And the bacteria have this special nitrogenous enzyme, and they can take nitrogen gas from the air that percolates down into the soil and produce ammonia. And alternatively, you can have a big tank at high temperatures and high pressures, and you can make this just from nitrogen in the air and from hydrogen gas. What they actually use typically is not hydrogen gas per se, but they start out with methane, natural gas. So industrially produced nitrogen is from methane plus natural gas. Now, this ability to make fixed nitrogen has had a tremendous effect on agriculture that I'm going to come to in a minute. But the way that it occurs in the soil is in these little nodules here that form on the roots of just a few kinds of plants, mostly legumes, beans, and related things like alfalfa, clover. Those are all legumes. Peanuts, interestingly, are legumes. All right. So the bacteria will stick to a spot on the root of the plant. The plant has sensors that recognize the molecules on the surface of the bacteria. And so the plant will grow plant cells enclosing the bacteria and make these little nodules. If you cut open one of these nodules, inside of it would be full of these nitrogen fixing bacteria. And you see, interestingly, this looks red. In fact, it almost looks like a little bit of hamburger in here. Well, one of the reasons for this peculiar structure is that nitrogen fixation requires an oxygen-free space. What you're doing is you're taking electrons and you're putting them onto nitrogen. And early on, we mentioned that oxygen has a very high affinity for electrons. And so if there's a competition in there, if there are nitrogen atoms and there are oxygen atoms, the oxygen atoms are going to get all of the electrons. They're going to suck them up, basically. And you won't be able to make ammonia. So within this space, there's a special protein that sort of binds to any oxygen that seeps through the walls of the cells here. It's an oxygen binding protein that is similar in structure and function to the hemoglobin that binds oxygen and carries it in our bloodstream. It's called leg hemoglobin. And just as our blood is red, we see the leg hemoglobin in these nodules, and it's red. And an interesting little sidelight here, a few of you have probably eaten some of the new plant-based hamburgers. There's Impossible Burger, and I don't remember the other one. One of those two, I don't remember which is which, makes their kind of plant-based meat red by incorporating this leg hemoglobin, the molecule that's found in these nitrogen fixation nodules. Okay. So what has happened in the last century and a half or so since the development of the process to make fixed nitrogen industrially has been a big increase in the amount of food that we can grow. So if you go back to the 1900s, we did not have any commercially available, industrially made fixed nitrogen available. All the food came from natural nitrogen fixation sources. Okay. But then when it started to be available after World War II, and then with a real boom available after World War I, and then a big boom after World War II, what we see is that there was a huge increase in the amount of food produced by the availability of these nitrogen fertilizers. And that was correlated with the big boom in the world population. Now, did the fertilizer cause the increase in the population? Well, I think what you can say is it could not have occurred without it. It would have been not possible to feed this big population without the availability of this fixed nitrogen produced by this industrial process. And this was in 2015. So right now, it's skewed even a little bit more, probably a little more than 50% of the food in the world is grown from fertilizer made industrially. I mean, where it's not, of course, of all the grazing cattle and those parts of the world where they really just can't afford fertilizer, there's still lots of food that's made in other ways. Okay. How this fertilizer was so important that another way they got it before the Haber-Bosch process was by mining it, and one of the rich sources was from bird droppings. What you see here is a penguin colony, and some of these bird droppings reach thicknesses of many hundreds of feet. And you've probably heard this story. These were these guano islands, a lot of them off of Peru and in the Pacific, and kind of in the late 1800s, 1900s. This was a big market. Send people out to mine this stuff, put it on sailing ships, and bring it back to Europe and in the old world to provide one of the few other ways that they could They fertilize their crops with these guano islands. Okay. Now, another way to go about introducing fixed nitrogen into a crop is to exploit the nitrogenous enzyme that's made by these bacteria associating with legumes, and using a cover crop to basically grow your own fertilizer. So this, of course, is an old agricultural process. It still happens today. And it does work, but it is of somewhat limited effectiveness in terms of the yield. So what I'm showing you here is this is red clover, which is a legume, which is being grown on a cover crop here. Or a lot of farmers will rotate soybeans, which is a legume, with corn, grow soybeans and then corn. Soybeans will leave some nitrogen in the soil. But if you measure this is called the plant available nitrogen. In other words, how much nitrogen actually is left in the soil and taken up by the next crop. Well, if you use some cereal as a cover grain, and this is often done just to prevent erosion and to add organic material into the soil, this has some advantages, but it doesn't really add any nitrogen because these are not plants that can associate with these nitrogen fixing bacteria. So as you add more and more legumes like a clover, and especially if you don't allow the legumes to fully mature, but you basically plow them under when they're at the stage of making flower buds, then you can add a significant amount of nitrogen to the soil, something on the up close to 100 pounds per acre. However, things like wheat, corn, etc., you can get yields that are triple that by adding nitrogen fertilizers. So most farmers will add nitrogen fertilizers up at the rate of 200 or 300 pounds per acre. So even if they grow a cover crop, they'll often put nitrogen on top of that because the yield that you get is just directly dependent on the amount of nitrogen. The more nitrogen, the better your yield. If the nitrogen is there, you just can't make the crop. You just don't have the nitrogen atoms in the right form to make amino acids to make a plant. So nitrogen, critical for food. Okay. So I think I'm gonna pause here to allow people to ask questions. Any questions out there about the first part of the talk here? You know, unmute yourself if you have questions. Anyone? I know Florence, I see. Are you?
Barry?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And Barry,
Yes.
am I on or is somebody else on? Okay. Wait, should I talk?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So my question is, we now know that, or we hear that we should not till crops because it's releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. But I go ahead and I plant legumes in my garden to add nitrogen. And my plan is, before I plant, I'm going to turn those under. So I'm tilling. So I'm adding nitrogen, but am I releasing bad CO2? What do I do?
Yeah, you're right. It's a trade-off. So I mean, what the farmers do is the two possibilities. You want to leave that whole crop on your field because you want all the nitrogen that's in the green parts to enrich your soil, and you want all that organic material in the green parts to enrich your soil. So right now, there are really just two ways to do it. One is to use some herbicide to kill the plant. You'll have dead plant on the top of the soil, but eventually it'll work down in there. Or if you don't want to use a herbicide, what they use is plastic They cover it with plastic,
Oh,
sun comes in, that kills the plant. And then they have special seeders now that will go in and just punch holes in this kind of through this mulch that's lying on the top, and the plant will come up through there. But this is the kind of technology being developed right now because it's best for the soil, and it's very important to keep the greenhouse gases being generated by soil cultivation, to keep those down. Okay, other questions?
okay, thank you.
Okay, Helene? Yes?
Yeah, thank you. I have a bunch of red clover seeds, some planted and some waiting because it's hard to grow a cover crop when it won't rain. But, you know, for a home gardener, it seems like, you know, you can cut those, you know, cut the green down and compost them. Would that work? So you're still keeping it and then incorporate the compost?
Yeah, you know, that works, and you can till it in. I mean, you know, there you have it's a plus and a minus. If you work it into the soil, it enriches your soil. Yes, there's a trade-off. You're going to release a lot of that as CO2. So, but still, that's a good practice.
And I have to say, covering it with plastic is a good way of killing all sorts of things, weeds that are sprouting up too. So it's not a bad idea if you've got a small garden crop. I mean, it's different if you've got acres and acres.
Yeah, you can reuse it. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Nancy.
Hi, Barry. A couple of years ago, I met this guy named Wes Jackson at UCSC because he won the Right Livelihood Award. And he runs this thing called the Land Institute in Kansas, where he has developed a kind of wheat that you never plow under, that's perennial. And it has 40-foot deep roots compared to like 3 or 4 for the kind of wheat. So what is the situation with that? How do you fertilize? You never plow it under. How do they fertilize that?
Well, so I don't really know much about the specific one. I have heard of these perennial weeds. I mean, so, you know, there are advantages as you don't have to cultivate. On the other hand, you do, what's the word I'm thinking? You often, so far, I think they don't have as high a yield, which is why it's not been widely adapted. But you've got to put nitrogen on the soil somehow. So, I mean, if they use, you know, if they're organic farmers, they'll use some kind of manure, composted manure, but the plant will go through a life cycle, I assume, where at one time of the year, it probably dies back and then it'll sprout out, just like grass on our lawns here. So in those times of the year when it's died back, that's when they can put fertilizer on it.
Well, they harvest it. I mean, it's not just that, yeah.
Right. Harvest, and then it'll die back. Then you'd fertilize it. Then you'd get the new growth. You'd go through that cycle.
You'll have to fertilize it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Well, then I'll go back here. Okay. And we were. Okay. Yes. Okay. All right. So let's go back, kind of moving from the farm. We've harvested our nitrogen containing crop. Now let's look at chemistry of it in our body. So I mentioned there are 20 kinds of amino acids, and on this linker carbon, there are attached other atoms. So here are the 20 different kinds. So the simplest one is the linker carbon just has another hydrogen, or it might just have a CH3, a methyl group. But some can be quite complicated, like tryptophan here, which has these 2 big fused rings. All of these are rather non-polar, we say, meaning they don't bind water. Notice there's no oxygen atoms in any of this, so they tend not to be plus or minus charged. These, on the other hand, have oxygen atoms, and so they will be slightly charged and they bind water. And these down here will actually have like acidic groups or amino groups, and they can be plus charged or negatively charged. And the fact that the minuses ones will bind the plus ones, these won't bind the water, these will, it all determines which amino acid gets stuck to another amino acid when the whole thing folds into a big complex. Now, before I leave this, I want to point out two particular side chains, two particular types of amino acids that are going to come up a little bit later. This amino acid called proline is different from all the others in that it forms a little ring in which this nitrogen is part of the ring. And that means that in all the others, when this nitrate gets linked to another amino acid, they all have the same type of bond, the peptide bond. But in this one, when this nitrogen gets linked to other amino acids, it's also got, it's linked to a carbon, and it makes it a different kind of bond. And that makes it have to be cut by a different kind of enzyme when it comes around to digesting proteins that have prolines in them. The second one I want to point out is this one down here that is different from all the others in that it has a sulfur in it. What this allows you to do is to bind to other identical amino acids somewhere else in the protein, so you can cross-link a polypeptide chain. Now, this cartoon may do a better job of explaining what I'm talking about. So the way a protein is made is these different amino acids are linked together where the nitrogen in the amino group links to the carbon in our carboxyl group, peptide bond. And this occurs in a long linear chain. This is all put together by the ribosome, this big protein manufacturing machine that's in all of our cells. However, there are a few places where this amino acid, cysteine, the one that had the sulfur on the end, comes to lie next to another cysteine, and these two sulfurs bond to each other. And so that, as we say, cross-links the chain. So besides the bonds between individual amino acids, you can have bonds that just, number 80, this is number 25, ends up getting linked to number 84 somewhere else. And so this whole protein I'm showing you here in this cartoon has 124 amino acids, and that's a rather small one. Now, what really exists in the real world is, of course, not a flat structure like this, but it folds up into a three-dimensional shape. And so this is a real structure of a real protein where we show the position of every atom as a little sphere. The reds are oxygens, the grays are carbons, the whites are hydrogens. And you see these three yellow ones sticking out here. Those were sulfur, cross-linked. This whole polypeptide chain turns into a jumble, but it's a very specifically arranged jumble and forms a very specific final shape. This is what most enzymes are. So when we eat protein, this is what we're eating. We're primarily eating enzymes, and a typical average size protein will contain about 500 different amino acids in its chains. The big ones can contain 200, 300,000 amino acids. They can be huge, but this is kind of average. And so when we're, if you eat meat, you're eating mostly muscle protein, and you're eating those ATPases and the fibers, actin and myosin that's in meat. If you're eating plants, you're eating a lot of the enzyme that fixes CO2 into sugars. You're eating mitochondria and all the enzymes in the pathway that makes ATP, et cetera. So protein is largely enzymes that we eat that are in the animal or in the plant for other purposes than their cells. And it comes into our digestive system, and we just unravel the chain. The low acid in our stomach kind of causes all these protons to bind to the atoms in the protein, and that disrupts all of the plus and minus charges that are holding this thing together. And it all unravels, and then enzymes that are resistant to this acid can chop this apart into individual amino acids. Now, let me talk about one particular protein, major element in our diet for most of us, that has some rather important food and health consequences. So we eat a lot of seeds, and mentioned that, soybeans, wheat, corn, rice, major part of our caloric intake. And in an American diet, we eat a lot of wheat. We use a lot of flour. It's pasta, bread, everything that's made from wheat flour. And these seeds, like wheat seeds, contain storage proteins, and they are there to feed the developing plant. So it usually is a fairly good mix of different amino acids, so that when the seed germinates, it will use the starch in the seed as an energy source, and it'll use the protein in the seed as an amino acid source to build all the enzymes for the developing plant. So let's look at what's in a kernel of wheat, a wheat seed. Well, it's mostly starch, 60 to 70%, but there's also a lot of protein, anywhere from 8 to 15%. And this is not just in the bran and the little embryo that gets rid of in the milling process. This is in the part that you use to make flour. And bread flour can be up to 15% protein. There's a little bit of bound water in there, very little fat in wheat. And what's called the ash here, the residue, that's where all the minerals are. That's where the potassium and the magnesium and the manganese, all of these other trace elements are in the ash. Now, what is this protein that's in a wheat kernel? Well, some of it is called an albumin or globulin. This is going to be food for the newly developed plant, but most of it is gluten, and we've certainly all heard of it. So gluten has an important role in the natural world. Its real world is to provide amino acids to support the growth of new wheat plants. Gluten is broken down into two different categories. There's one kind, gliadin, and the other is glutenin. So this is important for two reasons. One, it allows us to have bread and leavened bread, fermentation, etc. There's also the bad reason, in that gluten explains why about 1% of the Western population has celiac disease, which is a really, can be really disabling disease if people with it get exposed to gluten. And that is caused primarily by this component of the gluten molecule here called gliadin. Now, I'm going to give you just a kind of a cartoon version of what's going on here with why we need bread, and need meaning, punch down the bread, and why this can cause celiac disease, this particular protein. So gluten is a major storage protein in wheat seeds. So it has a good natural function in the world of wheat. The glutenin is a long linear chain of amino acids. The gliadin takes the shape of a much more tightly wound up ball. The chain that is formed initially winds up into this tight little ball. And in flour, these molecules are somewhat evenly dispersed throughout the flour granules after it's been milled. Now, when you add water, and water will bind to these molecules, they start to become associated with each other. One interesting thing about the biochemistry of the long one, the glutenin, is that at the ends of the molecules, there's the cysteine amino acid. That's the one that has the sulfur that can cross-link to other cysteines. And so what will happen is if you kind of mix them up so that they bounce into each other and get exposed to each other, then the end of this one will bind to the end of this one. And another one up here might bind to the end of this one. And you can take these rather short linear pieces and make very long linear pieces. There can be up to 100 or 200 individual glutenin molecules in one long fiber. And then these long molecules get cross-linked, in part by the gliadin, and also not shown in this cartoon, this molecule can actually get cross-linked over here. So when you're kneading bread, what you're doing is you're kind of mixing these molecules together so that they start cross-linking. And then you pound it down to stretch it out, which allows you to stretch out these molecules. And then you get more interaction, more binding of the one sulfur to another sulfur to make them even longer. And then you knead it down and you stretch it out. And so developing the gluten in the flour as a part of making bread, the final result is to get this big network of what functions really almost like rubber bands. They're all cross-linked, but they allow the bread to be very stretchy, and they're also kind of plastic in the sense that if you push them, they will spring back. And so this is why bread will rise, because you've made this network of these little water-covered fibers, and as the yeast in your bread dough is converting sugar into CO2, those CO2 bubbles kind of blow up to form little bubbles inside the bread, and that's what causes bread to rise. All right. Now, what's the downside here? Why celiac disease? Well, these chains, and these especially, have a lot of these prolines in them. They also have a lot of another amino acid, glutamines. And they're especially rich in proline, and it makes it harder for the enzymes in our digestive system to chop them up into amino acids. And we get fragments that have rather odd structures to them because they have this unusual amino acid composition. These are recognized as foreign particles by our immune system, and they react to them as foreign invading particles. And so we get an immunological response that can get out of hand. And that's, in a very coarse way, what happens with celiac disease. That's why people who are really have the disease, if they get a meal that has gluten in it, suddenly you've produced a lot of these fragments of these gliadin proteins, and there's just an inflammatory response to them, and it can cause damage to the lining of the intestine and to other internal parts of our body. Okay, now I should say, I am in no way an expert on the medical part of this, but I just find the biochemistry quite fascinating. So before I go on to that, let me give people a chance if they might have a question about gluten and gluten sensitivity, et cetera. Any questions out there?
Is it only wheat that causes celiac disease, or are there other grains that cause the problem?
Wheat, rye, and barley. And there's some dispute about some kinds of oatmeal. And sometimes it'll on oatmeal, it will say this was grown in or processed in a plant that was also processing wheat and other things. So oatmeal per se doesn't seem to have the same things, but mostly it's just wheat, rye, and barley. And so what's interesting is all plants make storage proteins like this, but for some reason, the ones in wheat have a particular amino acid sequence that's just seen as very antigenic to the human immune system.
Huh. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm the questioning one. My daughter has really intestinal problems, and she is an avid bread baker.
Mhm.
And she also likes to make sourdough bread, which she says that ferments differently and might not create as much gluten. Does that sound possible?
Well, the fermentation doesn't have any effect on creating the gluten. I mean, the gluten is there, and it may, in fact, I read a tiny bit about this, the degree to which you get this this cross-linked structure, that will be affected by, among other things, the pH of the water in which the flour is being kneaded. So different breads of different textures, etc., have different textures because of the cross-linking of the gluten molecules. So the short answer is yes, sourdough will have a different cross-linked form of gluten. But beyond that, and as far as its health effects, I just don't know. Yeah.
I have a question, Barry.
Yes.
The amino acids, I understand we need all of them. When we drink the amino acid salad dressing or things, are we getting enough? And how do we get enough?
So what was the last part of that? Say again.
There's amino salad dressing. Are we
Oh.
getting aminos in there?
Okay. Well, I'm going to come to that next, as a matter of fact.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Nancy?
So those little particles that are in between the short fibers that the celiac people react badly to, are they harmful at all to people who don't have celiac disease? Because it still sounds like they're setting off some kind of immune reaction.
No, they don't seem to be. So we can, 98% of the people, although it's hard to digest, we can digest them. Plus, all of that microbial flora that's in our gut, many of those bacteria can digest them. And, in the last 10 years, this has become a kind of new big complication, is a lot of things we couldn't understand in the past turn out to be differences, and not in any of our cells, but the flora that we have in our intestine. And so that could be linked. But the bottom line is, for most people, it's not a problem, and you can digest it, and it's a protein source. It's bread is actually a significant part of the protein intake that we get in our diet. Okay. Others?
Barry?
Yeah.
Yeah, Barry. I put something in the chat, but I've been told that old European wheat is okay because it doesn't have gluten. Well, I don't understand how this is possible. Is it just one of the components? What they say, we messed everything up in the United States, of course.
No, European wheat, 99% of the time, has gluten. It's the same. let me put it this way. If they didn't have gluten, all European bread would be flat as a pancake. You could only eat grapes.
That's what I
in Europe.
thought.
French would not be able to make
Right.
bread.
Exactly.
I think where this comes from
Right.
though, is that there is a variety of wheat, and it's quite different from any of your standard varieties. And I don't know if it's a different species or whatever, but there is one wheat-like plant that does not have gluten. But it's not what you see in typical flour. Yeah.
So then it's no different than sorghum and millet and all these gluten-free other things.
You mean this gluten-free wheat? Yeah, it's something like that.
Right.
I was just seeing, I read about that yesterday. I'll see if I can find that again. Actually, I'll mention here a little plug for a book. Boy, and I can't remember. The guy's name is Harold McGee, and he wrote a book on something like that, The Science of Cooking. I might run and get it before this is over because it's so good on the science of food. And I was looking through there and he was talking about this particular kind of wheat that doesn't have gluten, but it's rarely used. It's probably be hard to find. Okay, anything else? Okay, well, we'll go back here then. Okay. And where am I? Here we go. All right, so this question came up about whether different kinds of food will supply all of the amino acids. So that's an important thing to know about in our diet, that there are 20 different amino acids, and of those 20, 11 of them are amino acids that we can make in our bodies. We can make them from a combination of, well, we kind of have to have amino groups from other amino acids, but with just, we can convert like alanine and take off that amino group and put it on to other molecules to form the other amino acids. These 11 we can make. However, 9 of them we do not have the enzymes to make, or we can't do the final steps anyway. And so they are considered essential because we have to get them from our diet. Now, in an American diet, this is rarely a problem, because just think of, your average protein has 500 amino acids. What are the odds that it's missing any one of the 20? Well, it's very rare. Almost all proteins contain all 20 amino acids. But if you live on a diet that is an example, a real world example, that is just rice, white rice, or is just cornmeal, milled cornmeal, then you aren't eating a big variety of proteins. You're eating just the storage proteins that are in the white part of the rice or in the endosperm part of the corn kernel. And that can give rise to some serious protein deficiencies because they're deficient in certain amino acids. So rice specifically is missing this amino acid, lysine and threonine. Corn is also missing lysine. It's also missing this amino acid, tryptophan. Now, if you are a vegetarian and you only eat beans, you have the possibility of missing the amino acid methionine. However, grains have lots of methionine, beans have lots of lysine. And so if you eat beans and grain or beans and corn, this is the classic one, you eat beans and corn, the kind of South American diet, in the end, you get the whole mix of the amino acids. So as far as the question you ask about the specific amino salad dressing, it probably has some mixture of protein extract from beans and from some other complementary food. So you see in a lot of nutrition books, these suggestions for complementary foods. So if you eat beans and you're lacking methionine, you can make it up by eating some rice or nuts and seeds at the same time. So bottom line, if you eat a mixture of things, you really don't have to have any meat in your diet. You can get it from all vegetable sources really quite easily. All right, so what happens? You eat these proteins in your stomach and your lower intestine, they get chopped up into amino acids or into very small peptides, meaning just 2 or 3, 4 amino acids, a tiny little chain. There are transporters in the cells that line our intestine that bring these amino acids into our cells. They get transported into our bloodstream. And then what happens to them? Most of it is probably used to make ATP. So this amino acid structure can be broken down such that the amine group is combined with an oxygen molecule to make urea, and that your kidneys filter that out and put it into your urine, and you excrete it. And you can see why urine is a really great source of fertilizer, because it is so rich in fixed nitrogen. All right, urea is a good fertilizer source. It's important that we keep the amount of amino groups low, because they can produce ammonia. I mean, if you get NH3, you got ammonia. Ammonia is a very toxic compound. You simply do not want any significant levels of ammonia floating around in your bloodstream. And that's why you have this enzyme that can take the amino groups and make urea, and then you excrete it. All right. Now, what's left over here is a small molecule, 2-carbon molecule, that goes into the Krebs cycle. When we looked at that long metabolic pathway where glucose is the long linear chain, and then it goes into the cycle, most amino acids enter the pathway leading to ATP synthesis by entering the Krebs cycle, and there the electrons in these bonds are used to generate a proton gradient in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria makes ATP. So this is catabolism. And then the other route for our amino acids and our protein intake is we use them to make new proteins ourselves. You know, we're eating an enzyme, it gets recycled into its constituent amino acids, and we take those amino acids and we make our own enzymes from them. Nature is really good at recycling its molecules. Okay. So I want to touch on here, we're reaching the end of this talk, on kind of the big picture of how we deal in the natural world with these basic elements that go into our food. So emphasis again on how we're all solar powered. We depend on plants to make the basic molecules of sugars and lipids that we use as an energy source. We depend on these nitrogen fixing bacteria or other sources of nitrogen that plants can then take up to make amino acids. All right. And plants also provide us with phosphate and potassium. These are elements that are present in high amounts in our cells, and then all of these micronutrients that we need at small levels. Now, the big picture is that a lot of these elements in our food start out in the soil. The plant metabolizes them. It concentrates them in its seeds, and we harvest the seeds. So all of these nutrients are mined up out of the soil. They're harvested. They're shipped from South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. They end up on our table in Santa Cruz, and we eat them, And almost all of them end up being eventually excreted. They end up in the Neary Lagoon waste treatment plant, and much of it goes out into the ocean, and the sludge from this treatment plant either goes to the landfill, or years ago they used to send it to Southern California to grow cotton with. There's the nutrients that are in this wastewater sludge. What they're doing with them right now, I'm not sure. I wasn't able to find out. Maybe when we have the question time, if somebody knows, I'm really curious as to what we do with our sewer sludge now. But we have this fundamental problem in that the nutrients in the soil really don't have a way to get back to the soil. One thing that there are still real strict legal limitations to is recycling human waste and putting it on land that is used for human consumed crops. So in order to get our food, we somehow have to get phosphate and nitrate and all these trace elements back onto the soil. And it's one of the big challenges of modern agriculture, because we have become so efficient in really getting all of the nutrients into the soil, into the food that we eat. Now, touching on another point here, we've all heard that fat has more calories than carbohydrate or protein. So carbohydrates and proteins are very similar in roughly 100 calories per ounce. But fat has 250 calories per ounce. So why this difference? If you look at the chemical structure of lipids, fats, sugars, and amino acid proteins, you can see right away with your newly developed biochemical sense why this has more energy yield than this does. What's the difference? You will see it especially with the sugars, that almost every carbon here is attached to an oxygen. And in amino acids, this one also has oxygen. A lot of the side chains have a lot of oxygen, or this carbon is attached to this nitrogen. The basic way we get energy from our food is to take high energy electrons in these carbon, hydrogen, and carbon-carbon bonds and pass them on to oxygen, harvesting some of the energy as they go from high energy to low energy. But sugars and amino acids are already partially attached to oxygen. So, I mean, the energy is in our bodies basically produced, we burn it, we combine it with oxygen. It's just the same as we set fire to it with a match. And sugars are already partly burned. Amino acids are already partly burned, but the lipids are different. They have this little carboxyl group at the end. As we saw, many of these chains can be 14, 18 carbons long. There's no oxygen in here. And so all of the bonds in this molecule can be used as an energy source. Whereas over in the sugars, for example, these bonds here are not going to be useful as an energy source. So it's this lack of oxygen, the fact that all of this can be passed on to oxygen in the end, is what explains why lipids have a lot of energy, 2.5 times more energy than sugars or proteins. And one kind of practical consequence of this is, a lot of the potential food we grow is now being used not to feed people, but to make ethanol out of it. So something like 40% of the corn crop in the United States now is used to make ethanol. And ethanol in many ways is not a very good good fuel because it's already partly burned. It's already partly combined with oxygen. So if you compare here, for example, what's in gasoline, one component of gasoline is this molecule called octane. You heard about high octane gasoline. Well, this molecule has 8 carbons, an octet, if you will, all fully saturated. This is octane. It looks exactly like, in fact, is exactly like a short chain fatty acid in our body. Yeah, the carboxyl group to the end. Natural gas is a really good energy source because it has 4 hydrogens for every carbon. And so when you burn it, you generate less CO2, half of the CO2. See here, for every pair of hydrogens in a carbon, you've got one, the ratio here is 2 hydrogens per carbon. Here it's 4 hydrogens per carbon. So you just generate a lot of less CO2 with natural gas. You still do generate CO2, however. With ethanol, you know, you've already got this oxygen in here, and so it has less energy. I got interested in this question when I heard it on the radio one time. And somebody made the claim, they said that the amount of corn needed to make 20 gallons of gas, about enough that you need to fill an SUV one time. That amount of corn would feed a person for a year. And I thought, oh, that can't be right. So I sat down and did my little back of the envelope calculation, and it is right. Just in terms of the caloric inefficiency of efficiency of what we would do in our, you know, metabolic pathways to take the energy in that corn and convert it to ATP, we could in fact last for 1 year on it. And that same amount of corn would only make 20 gallons of gasoline. All right, interesting biochemistry behind the different yields of these different kinds of molecules. So last thing, this is my last chance to try to give you some nutritional advice, although that hasn't been the main goal in this talk for me. Just took this out of the car window one day. Had to notice that at the IHOP, 2 pork chops, 3 eggs, and 3 pancakes for $8.99. First piece of nutritional advice: if you order this, divide it with 2 other people. One of the major problems we have in the Western world is just the availability of a lot of cheap, high-fat food. Just for not many dollars, you can just buy a lot of calories. And so my final summary of nutritional advice here is, first of all, calories do count. Avoid gigantic servings. Major problem going to a restaurant. I suspect that many of you, like my wife and I, will often go and order kind of one entree and split it and easily have enough food. Secondly, that the calories are often in the fat, and you've just seen why they are such high caloric content. The big piece of advice: balance is the key. Eat a bit of everything. And in a way, the simplest recommendation of all that comes down from the nutritional people is just, if you look at your plate and you see some color on your plate, you've got a lot of green and orange and red, that means you're eating a variety of foods that have all of the range of amino acids and micronutrients that you need in your diet. If you look at your food and everything is brown, and often a lot of restaurants, especially inexpensive restaurants, you open up the menu with the pictures and everything is brown. Here, there's just a little bit of pale bits of lettuce here. Kind of avoid this in favor of this. And it's because it's best to eat food in which you're eating cells. You're eating this rich mixture of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, micronutrients. When food is processed, it's not what's left over is bad for you. It's just that so many of the good things have been removed. That's the problem. And the final bit of advice is that there are no magic foods. You know, every 6 months, there is a new thing come out. It's the best food ever. And if you just eat this, it'll cure all your illnesses and make you lose weight and you'll just be full of energy. But 6 months later, it just hasn't worked and there will be a new one coming along. So be skeptical about magic foods. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and open this up to questions. All right. I saw somebody actually had their hand up there before. Questions? Who was it? Oh, Helene, you had a question?
Oh, I think I asked it, but I went to my refrigerator and found this, which I think could be, which is talking about amino acids in salad dressing. I have to say, I still have 99% of the bottle because I find it impossible to eat. I keep saying, that must have been my vegan period. Anyhow, thank you so much.
Okay.
Useful info.
Yeah, well, see what the label on there says. It'll probably be informative. Okay. Other questions? Questions on food, diet, whatever?
No, I just want to say, Barry, thank you. This has been absolutely great. I have to go now, but thank you so much. Wonderful and really informative.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy.
Bye.
Okay. All right.
I really wanted
Oh.
a magic food.
What was that, Benita?
I said I really wanted a magic food.
Okay, Harriet, your question?
I think you touched on this at the beginning, and most people here might be interested in knowing why did they change the basic need of protein, the amount that you need, as you get over 65. You know, older people, we didn't know that during that period of time when they said, don't eat too much protein. We've gone through so much, but this is where we are now.
Oh, so you're asking why they changed that? Or
Yeah, what is it about our bodies as we age that can't process protein in the same way as we did earlier, and thus we require more?
You know, I heard about this because my wife Rusty said, oh, AARP says we have to eat more protein when we're older. So I started doing a little reading. And from what I read, the reason for this statement and for this push is one of these epidemiological studies where they have these long-term examinations of what people have eaten and what are their outcomes. And they find that there's a really strong correlation with people who have fairly high protein diets and who have a healthy outcome, meaning if they looked at people who had serious problems, cardiovascular problems, cancer problems, et cetera, it's correlated with deficient protein in the diet. So it's a correlation. But, you know, that doesn't really answer your question, Harriet. Why is that so? And I don't think they know. They don't know. And with any correlation, you have to worry. I mean, maybe people who eat well, just generally, you know, avoid bad behaviors, et cetera. And that's always the confounding issue with any epidemiological studies. So it seems to be true, but why it is that way, they don't really know. Yeah.
Question, isn't it in part related to sarcopenia that, you know, past the age of 50, we all lose up as much as 7 to 10 pounds of muscle per decade, and to build and maintain muscle, you have to have protein to do that. So the extra proteins required to maintain or increase your muscle mass.
Yeah, well, That's right, and it's a good hypothesis. I think what they haven't done yet is you would predict then that those people on the high protein diets have better muscle mass, and I don't think that's actually known.
I see.
I mean, it's, you know, it's a good idea, but I don't think they really know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, anything else?
So according to this label, it has 16 essential and non-essential amino acids. And it has in protein 310 milligrams per half teaspoon. I think that's what they're selling.
But does it say, it usually says it's from soybeans or from,
Yeah, soybeans. It's soybean and water, but it's not
Okay.
fermented.
yeah.
So,
Okay.
and then it's got 160 milligrams of sodium, and that's like it.
Yeah,
I guess if you're vegan, maybe this would help.
yeah. But probably, as you said, be better just to eat something tasty with a couple different kinds of beans in it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Good old
And,
rice and bean taco.
and it'll have all the fiber in it, and that'll make all your intestinal flora happy. And we know that that's important.
Yeah, that kind of brings up the thing about people saying juicing is a miracle way to get your vegetables and your vitamins in you, but you all the fiber is a waste product.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
I have another question, just a quick, just following up about your recommendation of that book, The Science of Cooking. Is that the one by Dr. Stuart Fairmont? Is that the one you're
No,
recommending?
you know, I'm going to run and get it right now.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, so it's on food and cooking,
Oh, on food and cooking, okay.
and it is by Harold McGee. This book has gone into a couple of editions. It's just a wonderful reference. So you can look up gluten, you can look up grains of rice, and it'll tell you what wheat is. It has all the question came up, well, what happens if you do make sourdough bread versus regular bread? And what's going on with the gluten? It's and really, really well explained too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I can put a link to that in the chat. Amazon has it for $21.
Okay.
Hardbound, I think.
Harriet?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I'm a big fan of Harold McGee, reading articles by him, and I think his latest one is on, it's called something like Nosedive. I don't remember the title. It's about the role of smell in taste and so on. But in recipes where amino acids, what do they call them? Amino, what Helene had. It seems that people use that instead of using soy sauce as an umami flavor, and much of the soy sauce has wheat in it. So it's gluten-free more than vegan.
Ah,
Yeah, that's a good point. For people who do have gluten allergies, this ability of gluten to make this elastic, flexible fiber is something that the food processing people have really latched onto. And so, you know, you can buy just straight gluten and then add it to other products, and they're doing more of that. So it's in things like processed meat, you know, spam-like things. I don't know about spam per se, can turn out to have a fair amount of gluten in it because it adds a certain texture to the food. And I think people who have the allergy get savvy to this, but be aware that gluten is extracted from wheat and added to a number of processed foods. And you really need to check if that's an issue for you. Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap it up, folks. I'm not, Lois, what's the next course? It might be, Roger, when is your course coming up? You're muted, Roger.
Sorry. My course will start next week, next Wednesday.
All right, okay, all right. You won't want to miss that. All right, it'll be terrific. Okay, well, thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Mary.
Thank you,
Thank
Barry.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ready?
Adios.
Bye all.